Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to give it about another minute for some additional folks to join us, and then we will get started. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us, and yeah, we will. It's a few minutes late, but I'm sure we will get through the content all right. So today's session we've titled Exploring the Barriers, Drivers, and Benefits of Public Participation in Research. And I just want to, again, thank you all for joining us. And a special shout out should go out to the Kids Brain Health Network, who is working behind the scenes today to ensure that our webinar goes smoothly and that everything works the way that they are supposed to work. So given that, we have a few learning objectives that we hope to get across to you today. The first is to more concretely define the concept of patient-oriented research, patient engagement in research, and sort of what that looks like. And then evidently we will explore some of the factors that either promote or inhibit that effective patient engagement throughout the research process. And then lastly, finish off by describing some of the benefits, the tangible benefits that are derived from involving the patient perspective in the research process. But really, before we get started, we just really want to get a sense of the perspective of all that is involved in today's session. So we have a few categories here that should pop up. We have a few categories here for some titles that perhaps you would ascribe to. So in the chat box in a moment, I will release a link, or you can just copy or type in what is produced on the bottom of the screen, and you will be taken to an external website where you can click on each of these categories that you most primarily are affiliated with, and then we'll kind of get a live reading on what of what our participation pool looks like today. So let me just pull up our question. So there we go. Yeah, so the URL is posted in the chat box, and it is just tiny.cc/CB_webinar. And if you just want to follow that really quickly, we'll get a sense of who is all on the line today. All right, so it looks like we have almost a three-way split between trainees, researchers, and other. And I believe those other categories are healthcare professionals and policymakers and that type of stakeholder group. So that's really great. I just want to encourage you to all keep this sort of distribution in mind as we continue on with our discussions. And I would encourage you to kind of keep this page open as we will be using this tool at least twice more throughout this session. Now, I'll be remiss to quickly just do some housekeeping before we move on. So we do have a few slides designated for discussion or question and answers. So what I would encourage you to do is you are all automatically muted when you signed on today. If you look on your control panel, there is a raise the hand option. So if we come to those slides where there are opportunities for discussion, I would encourage you to just click on that option. And then we will get a sort of notification on our end, and then we can unmute your microphone and continue the discussion that way. Should that not work for you, we can try just having you type in raise your hand or raise hand in the chat box and catch up with you that way. If we were to run out of time, perhaps don't get to discuss your topic or your perspective, I would definitely encourage you to just get in touch with me by email, and we can continue exploring that as we go along. All right. All right. So during our previous session, we introduced Canada's strategy for patient-oriented research and defined some of the contextual features that sort of precipitated the design of this strategy. We define patient-oriented research as research that focuses on patient-identified priorities. Patient-oriented research is something that moves away from a model of patients as subjects and strives to engage patients as partners throughout the research process. What this requires is that patient partners be engaged in a meaningful and active manner throughout the process, from study startup all the way through to the closeout of a study and disseminating the research findings more generally, and I guess more importantly, is aiding in ensuring that good research findings are implemented into effective and widespread policy change. And thirdly, patient-oriented research aims to apply the knowledge generated from research to improve healthcare systems and practices. Canadian health research has a global reputation for excellence. However, despite the quality of this research, we do face a tremendous challenge in turning this powerful information into high quality and cost-effective care. Thus, that leads us to this third feature of patient-oriented research, where the findings, or the research itself, is action-oriented with an eye to implement effective changes at both the healthcare delivery and the healthcare system levels of care. So in our last session, as I mentioned, we briefly covered what the contextual features were for implementing such a policy. So briefly again, what was the need, or why was there a need for trying to adopt this approach to research? Well, when you review some of the literature, it seems to indicate that nearly half of all patients don't receive treatments of proven effectiveness. If they're not receiving ineffective care, up to a quarter of patients are prescribed care that is not needed or potentially harmful. And what this comes down to is the fact that providing this type of healthcare that unfortunately is at times ineffective is also expensive. 5 years ago, it was projected that the Canadian healthcare system would be taxed with over $211 billion of costs for the year, which works out to about $6,000 per Canadian. So anecdotally, I guess we should not skip our slides. And I guess one major impediment we have is that there is a significant barrier to translating the findings of health research from the bench to the bedside, with a recent review indicating that it can take an average of nearly 2 decades to turn a mere 14% of original research findings to the benefit of patient care. Now, the factors that inhibit that translation are multifactorial and quite nuanced. And really what this slide, what these number of points are trying to anecdotally indicate is that there is a strong need for the research community to focus on research objectives that are derived from patient-identified priorities that could have a more meaningful and immediate impact on the care and lives of patients and their families. And essentially translating these findings into high quality and cost-effective care. So moving on to sort of the main topic of the discussion for today's session, it's time for us to consider some of the more practical issues associated with patient engagement in research or patient-oriented research. Really, how does it work? How can patients be engaged meaningfully and actively in the research process? So we're hoping to introduce this idea of levels of engagement or levels of participation. Some of you may already be familiar with Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation. In the late 60s, she was writing about citizen involvement in planning processes and described this ladder of citizenship participation. And as we have it here, it's often referred to as levels of participation. And ideally, the higher up you go on the ladder, the more empowered you are as a public member to influence the outcome of a decision that would ultimately affect you. There are various rungs that make up the ladder of citizenship participation. Each of these rungs have a specific goal in mind when involving the public. For example, when the goal is to collaborate with members of the public, the goal is to partner with patient partners and work together for advice and innovation in formulating alternative options and identifying the best solutions. Other rungs on the ladder include involving the public, where at this stage you are working with patient partners throughout the research process to develop viable alternatives. Informing, the level of informing ultimately leads to the point of keeping patient partners informed about updates or current ongoing practices. When you reach the level of empowerment, patient partners have a direct impact on influencing the decision and ultimately have the power to generate the change or to pursue an alternative that is being considered. And the fifth rung on this ladder is the level of consultation. And here, ideally, the goal is to listen to patient partner concerns and aspirations and take that into consideration when developing a proposal or an alternative. So the following activity is sort of going to be done to warm us up and help us understand the information that is about to follow, where we will be discussing the International Association for Public Participation spectrum of participation, which really is a sort of modern day version of Arnstein's ladder. So in a moment, I'm going to have you click back to that site where you were inputting your stakeholder group at a few moments ago. And we'll have a new question pop up. And ultimately, what you are going to do is, based on your opinion, you are going to rank these from the lowest to the highest level of participation. And what we mean by that is you, at the bottom of your of the list, you want to list that level of engagement that has the least impact on decision making, all the way to the top where you have ultimate control over instituting alternatives and moving policies further. So in just a moment, I'll have you click back, and then we can activate the question. There you go. So it should be ready to go, and you can just drag and drop the titles based on your perspective. There we go. Now it's live. All right, so it seems like we got a bunch of responses, and yeah, it seems like this group is really on the ball, and that really is the proper sort of arrangement of these categories based on the influence on impact on the ultimate decision-making ability of public involvement in any sort of consultation process. So we have to make sure we. Sorry, I forgot to move my slides over. So yeah, so just to review, the group definitely had it right. If we were to organize those categories based on the proper levels of impact on the decision-making process, we would start with the level of informing, where experts just relay information to the public without any sort of ability to provide input or impact the decision process that is ongoing in the background. A level up that engagement ladder is consultation, where experts are open to receiving opinions and feedback from the public or the stakeholders that are most affected, and depending on what their mandate is, they may or may not take that into consideration when they ultimately develop their proposal or their alternative. Moving up that ladder, we come to involvement, and here it's more of that back and forth process where experts, or in this case researchers, work in collaboration, work by engaging patients to a higher degree and work more collaboratively together. But building off of that idea of involvement, we reach this level of collaboration where there is a lot more interdependency and sort of mutual beneficial partnerships that are occurring to work together in proposing and eliciting new alternatives and ways of moving forward. And then at the peak of our levels of participation is this idea of empowerment. And here we have the public, and in the case of child rights and the strategy for patient-oriented research, we have patient partners directing all levels of research, and that would involve coming up with priorities, overseeing how work is done, how work is disseminated, and such. Now, again, similar to Arnstein's ladder, as we had mentioned a few slides ago, the International Association of Public Participation developed a participation spectrum as a way to help define the public's role aimed at ultimately making decisions. And as before, we just covered these. The same concepts are of our goals we just looked at. And really the same concepts are conceptualized here, just on a spectrum. And again, on the far right, rather than on the top, the more empowered individuals are, the more impact and influence they have on the decision-making process. Now, as I mentioned, we just went through those goals, but it's important to not only recognize that there are varying levels of influence on the decision-making process, but to also acknowledge that there are distinct promises that are made when you involve the patient at a particular level. So if you are saying you are consulting with the patient, there is an implicit promise that you make, and we will briefly consider those real quick. At the most basic level, the promise would be to keep the public informed. When you're at the level of consultation, you will listen to and acknowledge concerns that are related to you. When you involve members of the public, it's your promise that you will ensure that the issues and concerns raised will be reflected in ultimately the proposal that is developed and proposed for steps moving forward. If you aim to collaborate with the public, here it's to a greater degree of that involvement, where you will look to the public for direct advice and have their perspective relayed in coming up with innovative new solutions. And lastly, at the highest level of public engagement, is to grant complete control over to members of the public, where they direct the process themselves, and the expert will implement what is decided. So really, to sum up, what the ladder or spectrum of engagement intends to convey is that there are various degrees to which the public can be involved in any particular decision-making process, be it providing input on a new developmental proposal in your neighborhood, or as we see with the strategy of patient-oriented research, being involved within the research process. Under Canada's strategy for patient-oriented research, what we are really trying to get at in terms of our engagement with the public is to promote true and meaningful engagement of patient partners at the collaborate and empowerment levels. And really what this is intended to accomplish is to ensure that patient-identified priorities remain the focus of the research agenda, and that the work that is ultimately produced leads to effective interventions that ultimately inform policy change. But before we move on, I think it's important for us to all recognize that this shift of patient as subject to patient as partner is something that will evolve over time and is incredibly gradual. And really the reason for that is that much effort and resources must be extended to move the dial from the lower ends of the spectrum to regions of greater involvement. And as we will see, factors that drive or inhibit patient engagement efforts in research will be considered throughout the remainder of the session. And the hope is that that would sort of tune our attention and make us a tad bit more aware of some of the factors that ultimately influence how patient engagement happens within research projects. All right. So we'll start off with reviewing some of the barriers and drivers of patient engagement. It's important to just note here that the list we will be considering here is not exhaustive and is primarily just intended to orient you to the types of factors that either promote or inhibit effective patient engagement within the research process.
Hey, Pierre, we have a question from Jordan.
Sure. I think we can take a minute or two to try and respond.
Yeah, it'll just be in your questions box.
Question box. All right. So I'm trying to. All right. So Jordan was asking us, can you provide an example of patient partnership at the empowerment level? So that's a great question. Thank you, Jordan. So as I mentioned, we're kind of trying to move that dial from the lower ends of the spectrum all the way to that level. But I have to admit that I'm not aware of a completed research project where patient or public empowerment was the level of engagement that patients were involved in. So hopefully, if we have this discussion in a few years, in 5 years, we will start seeing that type of work. But as I had mentioned, what the strategy for patient-oriented research here in Canada is trying to get at is to reach that level between collaboration and empowerment. So we don't really know what that looks like yet, as this whole strategy is a grand experiment in and of itself. But that's essentially the goal that the strategy is trying to move towards. So I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but we can definitely just keep our eyes peeled and keep watching as this type of research gains more traction in North America and across the globe as well. All right. All right. So to give you a sort of brief overview of some of the barriers that impede patient engagement, the factors that we will be considering broadly fall under three main categories. The first is a lack of resources, which include money, time, training avenues, training resources. The second would be the research culture, and as this is a rather novel approach to research, there is some trepidation in researchers relinquishing control to incorporate more of that patient perspective. We will talk about ideas of tokenism, where patient engagement is only incorporated to check off a box on a funding application. And lastly, and I guess perhaps most critically, is the limited experience that we all have with patient-oriented research or engaging patients meaningfully and effectively throughout the research process. And ultimately, this is from the perspective of both the research community as well as the public, since this collaboration is rather novel. And we're all figuring it out as we go and learn from successes and failures of other projects or attempts at instituting this type of strategy. So that's definitely a large barrier that we will consider. All right. So in terms of the research culture, as we mentioned, there are a number of barriers that would impede the uptake of effective patient engagement. For instance, there are perceived conflicting priorities and tensions between researchers and patient partners. These include the perception that patients are biased and that their involvement will shift the research agenda from its original purpose through their input, and that researchers ultimately, I guess there's the perception that researchers ultimately would only wish to focus on areas of exciting and novel research areas instead of those that might be a bit more applicable or of interest to the public. And then, as we had briefly alluded to in the previous slide, a major impediment to meaningful patient engagement is this idea of tokenism, where patient involvement is primarily symbolic, and as I was saying, just incorporated at some rather low level to check off a box on a funding application. So what you would have here is, say, perhaps if you were filling out an application, you would say you're engaging patients because you are really at the end of your research, you have an open house and just inform patients of the sort of outcomes and outputs that you were able to generate through your work. So this really is approaching patient engagement in this way really is in stark contrast to truly being interested in exploring interventions that may be more applicable or relevant to any particular patient population. And lastly, And perhaps this is related to the tokenistic practices we were just covering, is the idea that researchers are unwilling to give up control of the research process and explore questions that are posed by others, in particular members of the public. Now, on the flip side, there are a number of factors that positively influence the uptake of patient engagement practices within the research process. These include senior researchers on a project fostering a trusting and positive environment, along with instituting the necessary resources to effectively engage patients throughout the research process. Another great driver of patient engagement is incorporating patient involvement right from the start of a project. And what is critically important is clearly defining the roles, duty, and expectations of both researchers and patients as they come alongside each other and collaborate on developing this relationship and working together. A great promoter of patient engagement is this idea of recognizing that on account of their lived experience, that patient partners present a unique perspective and have a great amount of value to contribute. And on the flip side to that as well is to recognize that researchers have expertise in developing research projects, conducting research projects, so their input is invaluable in helping design and refining research questions posed by patient partners. And lastly, a critical promoter of patient engagement is this idea of investing the necessary time and resources needed to build true and meaningful partnerships with all parties involved. Ideally, a partnership rooted in mutual respect that is focused on achieving a common goal, when provided with the adequate resources in terms of time and money, can develop that relationship and effectively work together to move their projects forward. And as we were briefly alluding to in the last slide, a significant barrier to patient-oriented research or engaging patients in the research process is that to do this right and to do this well requires time and money, both of which are oftentimes quite limited. So in terms of resources, you would need startup funds to start that collaboration with patient partners right at the initial stages of a project, where you are sort of refining your research agenda and developing a grant proposal. Since this idea of patient-oriented research is so novel, there are certain resources that are needed to develop training efforts or training materials that engages all of the relevant stakeholder groups and allows them to come and be on the same page and at the same table with the same amount of information that they would need to effectively work together as a team. And another resource that definitely is limiting is, since patient partners are so involved in this process, funding support is certainly required to help establish and promote compensation guidelines to aid in reimbursing patient partners for their time and efforts that they invest in helping develop and run these types of programs. And secondly, time. Patient engagement throughout the research process requires a more significant amount of time than research that does not. And ultimately, time is needed to build that relationship and trust to allow them to work in a collaborative manner. And ideally, these two factors are linked, in that if you were able to provide more resources, more time can be set aside to promote that activity. So in terms of the drivers, it's essentially the flip side of what we were just saying. Designated funding sources are required to promote patient engagement right from the start, and ultimately that leads into allowing more time to be set aside to further drive this collaboration and these activities. So, and lastly, another major barrier to patient engagement in the research process is its sheer novelty, which is something that we had alluded to in a few slides ago. So we really have a limited appreciation for the, oh, my slide's not coming up. We really have a limited appreciation for the evidence that supports patient engagement processes. Patient participation in healthcare quality improvement initiatives is well established and its benefits are widely known. However, on the research side of things, and the subsequent impact that patient engagement has on the process is not well defined, and it is something that will become more apparent as the strategy is tried out more and projects involving patient partners gain more traction throughout Canada and North America. Furthermore, additional barriers exist due to a limited understanding of what truly is entailed in running a patient-oriented research project, as well as disagreements on how to effectively implement and even how to go about implementing engagement strategies within the research process. Like, where do you start? At what level do you involve patients? What does it look like when you run a study? How do patients effectively contribute managing studies? And then those types of questions are what is at stake. Due to the novelty of the field, instituting a plan to evaluate or showcase the effects that PE has in the research process is lacking. But once that is more firmly established, it would help us indicate what works and what doesn't work, and would ultimately help promote the widespread uptake of successful patient engagement strategies. So then on the flip side, driving patient engagement uptake would be to incorporate patient engagement principles right from the start of a project, so that the collaborating team can learn how to work together, grow together, and ultimately experiment what works and doesn't work. And as I just briefly mentioned, down the line, a great driver for patient engagement efforts would be more evidence, more qualitative evidence, quantitative evidence of the effects that patient engagement throughout the research process has on developing and implementing the ultimate findings from a research project. All right. So another interactive activity we are going to consider. This is a two-part activity. So what we're going to do is, in a few moments, I'll activate the link again. So please go back to the web page you had open, and here what you are tasked with doing is listing the barriers from least to most important. Again, as before, drag what you think is the in your opinion the lowest barrier to the bottom, and have the top one rest at the top. What we'll do then in our second session is to open it up for discussion and sort of get your input on how we can overcome or suggestions that you think would be helpful in overcoming that barrier. So the barriers we have listed here is at the bottom, tokenism. So the symbolic involvement of patient partners throughout the process, patient partners' lack of research experience or training, scientific jargon or language used throughout the publication process or in meetings and all that. Fourthly, lack of support. This again involves time and funding resources to effectively institute patient engagement. And lastly, the inexperience of researchers collaborating with patient partners in the process. All right, so the link is active if you want to take a moment and just switch back to your web page, we can get a tally of what everyone's inputs look like. All right, so it looks like everyone had a moment to respond. So I was noticing as the results were trickling in that the symbolic involvement of patients and the inexperience of researchers working in patient engagement efforts were a close second as they were flipping back and forth. So that's those both are certainly very important impediments to the process. But clearly, the barrier that we all had indicated as being the most significant is the lack of support in terms of resources to effectively engage in the process. So we're going to build on that then, and for a few moments, again, if you want to just add to the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand, and we would love to hear some of your comments as to how you think we can move forward to overcome that barrier of not having enough resources to effectively implement this type of research. All right, Diane, so I see you have your hand raised, so I'm going to try to unmute you. So it's just so feel free to relay your comment or your thoughts. But if we don't hear you, I will let you know, and you can try again. All right, so you're unmuted, so go ahead.
Hi, it's Diane.
Hi, Diane.
I did write my comment in the questions, but it's okay. I can just read it. I just of those barriers, I thought above and beyond all these barriers that we listed, I think I work with SPORE in Alberta, by the way. I think the most significant is the culture of researchers not wanting to relinquish control of their own research. Comments on that?
Right. So how would you think we overcome that? So, and from my perspective, so the funny thing is, I mean, I come from basic research. So I've been a lab rat my entire life, and so from how I see it, like the only way, or one of the ways that you would gain traction on such a significant cultural change in how research is done is just by seeing the effectiveness of it. So from my perspective, I think we are very fortunate in Canada that we have this strategy put forth by CAHR to promote this type of research. But I think the onus is on all of these SPORE-funded entities to effectively evaluate the impacts of their work and demonstrate the effect that this ultimately had.
Yeah, I agree. And by effect, there's the effect on the research process, as you mentioned earlier, and the other, of course, is the impact on health outcomes, which is much more difficult to prove. But I agree that it's our responsibility to find research that does build the evidence.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. I would definitely agree with you, and I feel that all of the all of the SPORE networks and support units in the work that they do are really cognizant of that fact, and doing our best to evaluate how we're doing it, how it's being implemented, and ultimately, when these projects wrap up in a few years, evaluate the type of impact that patient engagement has had throughout the process. All right, thank you for that comment, Diane. So I see, Jillian, you have your hand up. We will unmute you if we can, and take your comment. All right. So it seems you are muted on your end now, Jillian. Yes, if you can, sorry, Jillian, if you can just try to click your unmute button, then we can make you go live. All right. So we'll try getting back to you in a second, Jillian. I'll just give the floor to Leah, who is from CanSolve.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Leah. Yeah, you're coming through.
Great. Just wanted to respond to the earlier comment about researchers not wanting to relinquish their control of the research priorities to patients or to research. For me, I feel like that's a bit of that's not from my perspective, that's not what we're trying to do with this initiative. For me, it's adding another perspective to the research table, which is someone as a patient with their lived experience, not only to me with their lived experience with an illness, but also the different professional or personal skills that they also bring to a table. To me, what we're trying to do is make the team multidisciplinary, and so we're adding someone who has lived experience to that team. I think that's why I have trouble with the ladder and the spectrum, because I think it puts value on empower, which is then giving all control to the members of the public, where to me, I kind of wish collaborate was at the far end. If we were to suspend all value at all, because I think informing and consulting is better than doing nothing. So I think the message I try and give is not that we're trying to take over the research enterprise from you, but we're adding to the richness of it by adding this unique perspective. And it's always the more heads and the more perspectives you have around the table, the better anything's going to be.
I think that's a great comment, Leah. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, really, that is what this comes down to, right? This is a challenging sort of initiative to try and get off the ground, but it's really important to get more perspectives at the table and get more voices represented there. And I think what we get at when we sort of comment on that idea of researchers not wanting to relinquish control is really just opening them up to the idea that there is a tangible benefit to involving those individuals who do have that lived experience in the discussion, and aiding in developing projects and initiatives that would be more immediately beneficial. But yeah, no, I think I agree with you that using that level, that spectrum or that level of engagement can be problematic, because it would imply that the more engaged you are, the better things really are. But ideally, would there really be a drawback to having more effective involvement of patient partners? Would it be that bad if research projects are more attentive to informing the public of their work? So I think all those have benefits, and ideally, if they can move towards the level of engagement where patient partners and researchers are engaged as collaborative partners, to work on these problems together, to come up with more and more unique and novel approaches, I think that can only add more benefit to the process. All right, wonderful. So I'm just cognizant of the time. I don't want us to have to stay on too long. So we will soldier on and for my slide deck and finish things off. So unless there were any further questions or topics you wanted to cover based on these previous few slides, we can spend a few seconds on that. But if not, we will move on, and at the end, we'll definitely have another opportunity to open the floor up for questions or comments. All right, so moving on to the final objective of this session, we want to cover some of the benefits of incorporating public participation in the research process. During our last webinar session, I guess a month ago, we again had a diverse group of participants that were made up of researchers and patients and trainees. We prompted the participants with a query that was intended to explore what their thoughts were regarding the potential benefit of patient engagement in research efforts. Here are sort of the responses that we had received. So their responses included generating relevant research questions based on lived experience of patients, focusing on outcomes that were beyond mere clinical utility, and employing patient engagement as a strategy to increase the quality of research outputs. So with the group that we had last time, there certainly was consensus that there is some inherent utility to involving patient partners in the research process. So here we will broadly consider a few of the benefits of patient engagement and showcase a tangible example of how incorporating the patient perspective has benefited research outputs. Now I'll be remiss to not plug our next session. So in July 26th, I believe, our next webinar is scheduled. And ideally what that will cover is, once we've established some of the barriers and some of the benefits of patient engagement, we will go and discuss sort of the practical considerations of how patients are involved at various stages of the research process and what that ideally could look like. All right. So as we are alluding to, is that patient engagement can have tangible benefits at all levels of the research process, right from the start of a project where you identify and prioritize the research topics that are considered to be pursued by the research group, as these priorities will could ultimately be more relevant to the needs of a particular patient population. Throughout the study, or I guess at the study's design phase, benefit of patient engagement involves ensuring that your protocols, your design of your questionnaires, of your outreach efforts are appropriate to an intended target population. When it comes to promoting or communicating the work of the research, patient involvement can help adapt scientific language or jargon to be more accessible and easily digested. And lastly, patient involvement will enable projects or research projects to be able to convey more powerful messages about the research findings, since as a patient partner, you are able to better relate how these findings affect your experience and be a more empowered sort of self-advocate for developing or instituting some more wider policy change. All right. So I'm hoping we won't keep you much longer after the deadline. So I will rapidly go through the next few slides. But ultimately, what we will do here is showcase a project where public participation aided in improving the outreach and dissemination efforts of research findings. So we did circulate the paper to you all. So if you haven't had a chance to review that, I would definitely encourage you to take a look as well. So just for some context, the Newcastle Cognitive Function After Stroke Study, or COGFAST for short, was a 4-year project that was investigating why there was an increased risk for developing post-stroke dementia in patients. The particular project that we are considering here wanted to improve the knowledge translation efforts of their study findings by collaborating with a group of patient partners to produce lay summaries of some of the work that this group had done. So the aims of this of involving patients in this knowledge translation exercise was to select and prioritize individual studies from the published work that this research project had developed, and to prioritize those projects that were most relevant and of most interest to members of the public. Secondarily, the idea was then to produce lay summaries that were related to these selected projects, and then ultimately communicate this work through a website that was designed to be more accessible to the public. So the ultimate goal, again, as we said, was to prioritize the lay summaries of 4 research projects and to improve the summaries so that they were more suitable to the lay audience members that they were designing them for. So patient partners were able to improve the quality of the lay summaries in the following ways. One, by prioritizing research topics. So they were reviewing the references or the literature that the project had produced, and then ultimately prioritized a select number. So apart from prioritizing the projects, they provided opinions on formatting and the non-textual elements of the work to aid it in conveying the material more effectively. And lastly, adapting the text to be more accessible by limiting the unnecessary use of scientific language or jargon. So once the group had selected a number of published articles to review, the research group went and developed 8 lay summaries, and the patients were asked to prioritize the 4 they felt were most important to them. Now, if you review the paper, you see that there was some debate over what constituted importance, but ultimately the group decided that they should prioritize those works that were interesting to the general public or to patients who were perhaps at risk of developing post-stroke dementia, and ultimately the usefulness of each article as well. All right. So one of the main points raised by the group as they were reviewing these lay summaries was that definitions should be removed and instead be included as a glossary of terms. They argued that definitions within the text made it cumbersome and repetitive, which would certainly be a barrier for readers trying to be engaged with the content. And what we found interesting in reviewing the article was that one of the participants commented that whilst unnecessary complexity should be avoided, language should not be dumbed down too much. And really, this is an important point to consider, as members of the public or a lay audience is usually well educated in their own right, and there's no reason to dumb down the language to a degree that would make it ineffective. So ultimately, overall, the patient partners who had collaborated on this project, through their critiques, had helped enhance the content so that it was easier to understand, as well as increasing the findings to be more widely accessible to the public at large. Because ultimately, if these studies just languish in a journal somewhere and are not really taken up by knowledge users, then it unfortunately is a detraction of the great work that people or that researchers ultimately do. In terms of the formatting and the non-textual elements, these partners provided their opinions on how the project should be formatted. and they were highly in favor of a Q&A sort of style layout and preferred headings that ask questions as opposed to just statements. In their review process, it turned out that they disliked the continuous paragraph format and suggested that text should be separated into more digestible, smaller sections. And really, most importantly, they found that putting the aims of the study and a quick read summary at the beginning would be a great way to get the attention of a lay audience. And in terms of the non-textual elements, the volunteers had indicated that tables should not be included at all in a lay summary, and graphical elements should only be included if they were easy to understand. And really, they stressed the idea of colors and images to design output efforts in a way that was appealing and fun to look at. So ultimately, what did these look like? So they essentially went through multiple versions of their abstracts, of their lay summaries. So here we have an image or a view of what the original version looked like. So you can see it's very text heavy, lots of graphs. It's very condensed, and yeah, it might convey all of the information, but it's not communicated in a way that is very appealing. So based on the output from the group, they generated a second version, which is still a bit text heavy, but they incorporate a summary, some images are involved, and this ultimately led to the final version, where the material was expanded. You see the quick read summary on the top. Images again are incorporated to make the material a bit more appealing. Paragraphs are spaced out, and the content is more easily communicated. So by prioritizing the topics, adapting text to be lay-friendly, and improving the formatting and inclusion of non-text elements, the patient partners or the public who had contributed to this process were able to enhance the lay summaries in both content and appearance. And really, ultimately, anecdotally, this ensures that relevant users are more inclined to read the lay summaries, which ultimately results in the better dissemination of research findings. All right, so I know we are, thank you for your patience, I know we are about 5 minutes over time, but if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them. Feel free to reach out to me by email. So we'll check if you put your hand up, we'll check in on that. But in terms of next steps, in the next day or two, we will reach out to you with a post-webinar survey, and this will just really help us out in terms of enhancing the content and the delivery of the webinar that you had just attended. So your input would be much appreciated. And just as a reminder, if you have not signed up for it yet, our next webinar is scheduled at the end of the month on July 26th. And again, this is sort of a practical session on how patient engagement can be incorporated throughout the research process. Now, if you wanted to get a hold of me, you can find my contact details on the Childbright training website, or you can just shoot me an email at the listed email, or communicate through the message that we've been sending back and forth to you over the last few days. So if there are no questions, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us today, and I hope that the session has been useful to you, and that we were able to interact a bit more and learn more with each other. All right, thank you so much.
So I think you can